If you're over 60 and you keep waking up around 3 a.m., fully awake, not half asleep, not drifting in and out, this is something worth paying attention to. I'm Dr. Jonathan Reid. I've spent more than 30 years working with adults over 60, and this specific wake-up time shows up far more often than people expect. This is not just normal aging. Plenty of seniors sleep straight through the night, but when this pattern does appear, it usually follows a very consistent nighttime rhythm inside the body. What's important to understand is this. Waking up at 3 a.m. isn't random, and it's not simply about poor sleep habits. Something in the body is changing how it behaves during the early morning hours, when everything is supposed to be quiet and restorative. During the day, the body has support systems, movement, light, activity, but between 2 and 4 a.m., those supports fall away. That's when small internal shifts become much easier to notice, and the brain responds by waking you up. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the 5 core reasons this happens in adults over 60. These are patterns I see repeatedly in clinical practice, often in people who are otherwise doing many things right. If this sounds familiar, take a moment to like the video. It helps other seniors find information like this. And if you tend to wake up at the same time most nights, leave a comment below. That detail matters. Stay with me. Once you understand which nighttime pattern applies to you, the picture becomes much clearer. Reason number 5. Cortisol rises too early. When awakenings happen at the same hour night after night, the cause is rarely emotional. Stress creates variability. Hormones create precision. In adults over 60, one of the most common precision errors involves cortisol. Cortisol isn't only a stress hormone, it's a timing signal. Under normal conditions, cortisol stays low through the night and begins rising closer to morning, preparing the body to wake. With age, that timing can shift. Instead of waiting for daylight, cortisol may begin rising between 2 and 3 a.m. When it does, the brain interprets that rise as a clear instruction. Become alert. This explains a very specific pattern. People don't wake gradually. They don't drift in and out of sleep. They wake decisively. Heart rate increases slightly. Mental clarity returns quickly, and the body resists slipping back into deep rest. Not because of worry, but because the wake-up signal arrived early. This is where cortisol is often misunderstood. Many people assume cortisol only rises in response to stress, but cortisol does not require conscious stress to activate. It responds to internal signals, blood sugar stability, circadian cues, inflammatory tone. When those signals drift with age, cortisol can rise prematurely. That rise alone is enough to flip the brain from sleep mode into alert mode. I see this most often in patients between 65 and 70. One example is Linda, age 67. Linda told me she woke almost every night at 3:05 a.m. Not panicked, not worried, just suddenly awake. She described it clearly. It feels like my brain turns the lights on. Her daytime stress levels were low. Her sleep habits were consistent. But her wake-up time was precise. That precision matters. Random awakenings suggest habits or environment. Clock-precise awakenings point to hormone timing. In Linda's case, cortisol was rising too early. This early cortisol awakening response does not happen to everyone. Many seniors maintain a normal cortisol rhythm well into their 70s. That's why this is not just normal aging. Aging creates the conditions for timing drift, but it does not guarantee it. When cortisol rises early, sleep doesn't fragment gradually. It ends abruptly. That's why people often describe being wide awake instead of groggy. And this is where many interventions fail. Trying to force sleep back with willpower doesn't work because the brain is responding appropriately to a biological signal. The signal is simply mistimed. Understanding this reframes the problem. You're not failing at sleep. Your body is waking you up too early. And once that happens, the nervous system resists returning to deep rest. This reason sits at number 5 for a reason. Because early cortisol rise often overlaps with the next 2 mechanisms, melatonin timing and nighttime blood sugar stability. But on its own, this mechanism already explains a large number of 3 a.m. awakenings in adults over 60. Not because something is wrong with you, but because a hormone that's supposed to wait until morning has started acting on its own schedule. Reason number 4, melatonin peaks earlier, then drops too fast. This reason is often missed because people focus on how much sleep hormone they have, instead of when it acts. Melatonin is not just a sleep aid, it is the body's internal night clock. Its job is to signal darkness, sustain sleep, and hold the brain in a restorative state until morning. After 60, that clock can shift. In many seniors, melatonin begins rising earlier in the evening. Sleepiness appears sooner than it used to, sometimes as early as 9 or 10 p.m. At first, that feels like a good thing. People assume they're sleeping better because they fall asleep quickly, but that early onset often hides a deeper problem. The melatonin peak doesn't just come earlier, it also drops sooner. Instead of staying elevated through the early morning hours, melatonin can fall sharply after midnight. By 3 a.m., levels may already be too low to sustain deep sleep. This creates a very recognizable pattern. Falling asleep is easy, staying asleep is not, and when wake-up happens, it's not groggy or half-formed. The brain feels alert. This is why many sleep medications fail after 60. They help initiate sleep, but they don't fix the underlying clock shift. You can add more melatonin, but if the timing architecture is off, the effect fades too early. This is not a discipline problem. It's not about willpower or bedtime routines. It's a circadian timing issue. I see this frequently in patients in their late 60s. One example is George, age 69. George told me he felt sleepy almost every night by 9:30 p.m. He would fall asleep within minutes, but he woke consistently between 2:45 and 3:15 a.m., wide awake, not anxious, not restless. He assumed he was just getting old, but his pattern was precise. That precision points to clock hormones, not habits. In George's case, melatonin was rising early and dropping too fast. Light exposure earlier in the day, reduced evening stimulation, and correcting circadian cues mattered more than adding sleep aids. This distinction is critical. Melatonin is meant to hold sleep, not just start it. When its decline comes too early, the brain loses its night signal. Other systems begin to take over. Cortisol becomes more influential. Blood sugar regulation becomes more fragile. The brain becomes more responsive to minor internal changes. That's why this reason sits directly after cortisol on the list. These systems interact. An early cortisol rise is more disruptive when melatonin has already fallen. And once melatonin support fades, the brain becomes far more sensitive to shifts in blood sugar and circulation, which we'll discuss next. This pattern does not affect everyone. Many seniors maintain stable melatonin timing well into older age. That's why this is not simply normal aging. Aging changes the clock's flexibility, but it doesn't force it to break. When melatonin timing shifts, sleep doesn't unravel slowly. It releases early. People often describe it as, "My sleep just lets go." Understanding that changes the response. The goal is not to sedate the brain, it's to stabilize the night signal. Because once that signal weakens, the body stops treating the early morning hours as protected sleep time. And the brain does exactly what it's designed to do. It wakes you up. Reason number 3, nighttime blood sugar dips. This is one of the most overlooked causes of waking up at 3 a.m. because it rarely looks like classic low blood sugar. People don't wake up shaking. They're not sweaty. They're not hungry. Instead, they wake up alert. That's why this mechanism is often missed. During the day, blood sugar is supported by regular meals, activity, and light. At night, that support disappears. Between 2 and 4 a.m., the brain depends on a steady glucose supply to remain asleep. When that supply dips, the brain doesn't negotiate. It protects itself. After 60, several things increase the likelihood of nighttime glucose drops. Dinner is often lighter. Carbohydrates are reduced intentionally. Protein intake may be inconsistent. At the same time, mild insulin resistance becomes more common with age. This combination creates instability. Glucose levels may remain perfectly acceptable during the day, but drift too low during the early morning hours. When that happens, the brain activates counter-regulatory hormones. Cortisol rises. Adrenaline follows. Not to create anxiety, but to raise blood sugar quickly. The result is sudden wakefulness, not gradual, not emotional, protective. This is why many people describe waking at 3 a.m. feeling clear, not distressed. They assume their mind just turned on. In reality, the brain initiated a survival response. I see this frequently in patients in their early 70s. One example is Harold, age 72. Harold had been intentionally eating lighter dinners for years. He avoided carbohydrates at night and finished eating by 6 p.m. He woke almost every night around 3:20 a.m. Fully alert, no hunger, no anxiety. His daytime blood sugar readings were normal. Nothing suggested hypoglycemia, but his nighttime pattern was precise. That precision matters. Random awakenings point to environment or habits. Clock-consistent awakenings point to internal regulation. In Harold's case, nighttime glucose was dipping just enough to trigger a hormonal response. Not enough to cause classic symptoms, but enough to wake the brain. This is why many people don't connect the dots. They think, if my blood sugar were low, I'd feel shaky. At night, the brain responds earlier than the body. It wakes you up before damage occurs. That's its job. This mechanism also explains why some people feel worse when they eat too lightly at dinner, and why skipping evening protein can backfire after 60. It's not about eating more. It's about eating appropriately for nighttime stability. This reason also overlaps with the previous two. When melatonin drops early, the brain becomes more sensitive to metabolic changes. When cortisol timing is already drifting, the threshold for activation is lower. Blood sugar dips don't occur in isolation. They stack. That's why treating this as insomnia often fails. Sedatives don't correct glucose instability. Relaxation techniques don't override survival chemistry. The brain will choose protection every time. It's also why this reason doesn't affect everyone. Many seniors maintain stable nighttime glucose well into older age. Others develop this pattern gradually without warning. Again, this is not just normal aging. Aging increases vulnerability, but behavior, timing, and metabolism determine whether the signal crosses the threshold. When nighttime glucose dips are addressed, wake-ups often become less abrupt. Not because sleep is forced, but because the brain no longer needs to intervene. This reason sits at number 3 because it bridges hormones and circulation. Blood sugar instability influences cortisol. It affects blood pressure regulation, and it increases sensitivity to bladder signaling, which we'll discuss next. Understanding this reframes the experience. You're not waking up because your mind is restless. You're waking up because your brain is doing its job, protecting itself at a time when support is lowest. Reason number 2, nighttime blood pressure and circulation shifts. This reason is less talked about, but it carries some of the strongest medical weight. Because when the brain wakes you up at 3 a.m., without anxiety, without racing thoughts, and without discomfort, it is often responding to circulation, not sleep quality. Blood pressure is not static. Under healthy conditions, it follows a predictable nighttime pattern. It drops slightly during sleep, then rises again toward morning. This dip protects the heart and allows the brain to rest. After 60, that pattern can become unstable. In some seniors, blood pressure drops too low at night. In others, it fluctuates unpredictably instead of staying steady. Both situations affect cerebral circulation. The brain is extremely sensitive to changes in blood flow. Even small reductions in perfusion can trigger an alert response. Not panic, not fear, alertness. The brain does this to protect itself. This is why these awakenings often feel emotionally neutral. People don't wake distressed, they wake awake. Many seniors experiencing this have a history of hypertension. Some are taking blood pressure medication, often in the evening. That timing matters. When medication lowers blood pressure too much overnight, or when vascular stiffness prevents smooth regulation, cerebral blood flow can dip below the brain's comfort zone. The response is immediate. The brain increases alertness to restore circulation. Sleep ends abruptly. I see this pattern frequently in patients over 70. One example is Edward, age 74. Edward had well-controlled blood pressure during the day. He took his medication with dinner as instructed years earlier. He began waking consistently between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m., fully alert. No anxiety, no physical discomfort. He assumed it was insomnia, but his pattern was too precise. Daytime readings looked fine. Nighttime regulation was the issue. Edward's blood pressure was dipping too low during sleep. Not dangerously low, but low enough to reduce cerebral perfusion. His brain responded appropriately by waking him up. This is an important distinction. The brain does not wait for damage. It responds to trend. When circulation becomes unstable, the brain prioritizes awareness over sleep. This mechanism is often missed because people associate blood pressure problems with symptoms: dizziness, headaches, palpitations. At night, the signal is different. The symptom is wakefulness. This is also why relaxation techniques don't help in these cases. The nervous system is not overactive. It's protective. And this reason becomes more likely as vessels stiffen with age. Arteries lose elasticity. Pressure regulation becomes less smooth. Instead of gradual adjustments, the system overshoots and undershoots. That instability is enough to disturb sleep architecture. This does not happen to everyone. Many seniors maintain excellent nighttime blood pressure control well into older age. Again, this is not just normal aging. Aging increases vulnerability, but medication timing, vascular health, and autonomic control determine whether this signal crosses the threshold. This reason also interacts with the earlier ones. Low nighttime blood pressure increases cortisol sensitivity. It amplifies the brain's response to glucose dips, and it increases the likelihood that bladder signals will break through, which we'll discuss next. That's why this reason sits at number 2. It's not dramatic, it's not emotional, it's medical. And when it's present, sleep disruption is not a failure of rest, it's a safety response. Understanding this reframes the experience. You're not waking up because your sleep is fragile. You're waking up because your brain is monitoring circulation during a vulnerable window. And when stability wavers, sleep becomes secondary. Reason number 1. Bladder signaling and aging kidneys. This is the most common reason people over 60 wake up at 3 a.m., and also the most misunderstood. Many people believe they wake because they need to urinate, but in aging physiology, that sequence is often reversed. The brain wakes first, the bladder speaks second. To understand why, we need to talk about nighttime hormone signaling. In younger adults, a hormone called ADH, antidiuretic hormone, rises at night. Its job is simple: reduce urine production while you sleep. That allows the bladder to stay quiet until morning. After 60, ADH signaling often weakens. The hormone may rise less, or it may not stay elevated through the night. When that happens, the kidneys produce more urine during sleep. This change is gradual, and it's very human. Aging kidneys filter differently. They respond less strongly to nighttime signals. The result is increased nighttime urine volume, even without drinking more fluids. But here's the critical point. In many seniors, the bladder does not wake the brain on its own. The brain wakes because something else shifted first: blood pressure, blood sugar, cortisol, or circulation. Once the brain becomes alert, it becomes aware of bladder fullness. That's when the urge appears. This explains a pattern many people recognize. You wake up, you feel alert, then you notice the need to urinate. You go to the bathroom, you return to bed. And now falling back asleep is difficult, not because of the bladder, but because the brain has already exited deep sleep. I see this most often after age 75. One example is Margaret, age 78. Margaret told me she woke almost every night around 3 a.m. She assumed it was because she drank too much water. But even on nights she restricted fluids, the pattern continued. She would wake first, then notice bladder pressure. Her issue wasn't poor habits, it was altered nighttime hormone signaling. Her kidneys were producing more urine at night, and her brain had become more sensitive to internal signals. This is why simply blaming fluids misses the point. Yes, excessive evening intake can contribute, but in many seniors, the underlying driver is biological: a DH decline, renal aging, and increased nighttime urine production. This also explains why nocturia feels different after 60. It's not urgent, it's not painful, it's persistent, and once the brain is awake, sleep becomes fragile. This reason sits at the top of the list because it often represents the final signal. Earlier mechanisms weaken sleep stability. This one breaks it. Low blood pressure reduces cerebral support. Glucose dips trigger alertness. Melatonin drops remove the night signal. Then the bladder becomes the loudest voice. But it's rarely the first one. That's why treating nocturia alone often fails. You can limit fluids, you can avoid caffeine, you can manage bladder habits, and still wake at 3 a.m. because the root cause lives upstream. This is not a moral failure. It's not poor discipline. It's a predictable result of how aging alters nighttime physiology, and it does not affect everyone. Many older adults maintain strong ADH signaling and stable kidney rhythms well into their 80s. Again, this is not just normal aging. Aging creates vulnerability, but the pattern only appears when multiple systems overlap. When it does, the experience can be frustrating, not because it's dramatic, but because it feels final. I wake up to pee and that's it. But understanding the sequence matters. You didn't wake up because you needed to urinate. You noticed the need because you were already awake. That distinction changes how the problem is approached. The goal isn't to silence the bladder. It's to stabilize the nighttime signals that keep the brain asleep. Once those signals hold, the bladder often becomes quieter on its own. This reason is number one, not because it's the most severe, but because it's the most visible. And visibility often hides the deeper cause. If you've been waking up at 3 a.m., what you've heard here should change how you look at it. This isn't one problem, it's a convergence. Hormone timing shifts, metabolic protection steps in, circulation adjusts, kidney signaling changes. When those systems overlap during the quietest hours of the night, the brain responds by waking you up. That doesn't mean something is wrong with you, and it doesn't mean this is something you simply have to accept. This is not just normal aging. Many seniors sleep through the night without interruption. When this pattern appears, it follows clear biological rules. And once you understand those rules, the experience stops feeling random. You're no longer guessing, you're recognizing signals. If this explanation helped you understand your own sleep pattern, consider sharing it with someone your age who's dealing with the same issue. And if waking around 3 a.m. has become familiar for you, you can leave a comment with your age and where you're watching from. Patterns like that matter. Here we focus on practical, biology-based ways to care for your health as you age, without hype, without fear, and without oversimplifying what the body's actually doing. Once you understand the signal, the symptom stops feeling mysterious. I'll see you in the next video.